So since this is the second church that we're going to be looking at in terms of these addresses, it's important for us to point out in this first verse that you see on the screen the tendency that occurs in all of the letters to each of these churches. Jesus claims a different title of authority in each letter. And they sort of give us then a preview about what he's going to talk about with each church and what he's going to focus on in terms of what he tells them. For instance, last week when we studied Ephesus, we saw this: the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. And that set up for us what ultimately was the threat that he would remove the lampstand. In other words, he was over the lampstand. So we kind of got a little preview before we got into the letter of what Jesus was all about, his authoritative structure and what he was about over all of the churches. So what we see here in verse 8 is the words of the first and the last who died and came to life, which correlates as we go through this letter in what he tells the church of Smyrna, because he's reminding them that he is the eternal one who suffered and ultimately died at the hands of his persecutors and then was resurrected. So as a result, he has this unique understanding of suffering and persecution. And as we go through this letter, you're going to see why he wants them to know that, because there is the disconcerting nature of persecution affecting them. And it is disconcerting. It appears that among the difficulties facing the church in Smyrna was that there was a deep-seated poverty for this church. Not only that, they were being openly slandered amidst of some sort of localized persecution that was even deeper than the typical Christian in Asia Minor encountered. Because this is what we see in verses 9 and 10. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, we don't know what the particular persecution was, but we do know that the church in Smyrna suffered regular persecutions and regular intervals of trial throughout its history. In fact, Polycarp was one of the early church fathers. He was discipled by John the Apostle, and he was martyred after he became bishop of Smyrna in AD 155. By the way, we kind of just throw that out there like, oh, he was martyred. It was 1900 years ago, so, whatever. He's martyred. But it's not some light thing that happened to Polycarp. Let me tell you how he died. Polycarp was burned at the stake. Well, actually, let me say they attempted to burn him at the stake. They lit the fire. He burned partially, but the fire went out before he died. So they stabbed him in the heart. See, they really wanted him dead. We are not going to have the same thing that happened with John the Apostle, where we boiled him in oil and he lived. He's going to die. They wanted him dead. But listen to his statement. Right? As they're asking him to recant, they're tying him to the stake. He says this: you request that I recant. How then can I blaspheme my King and Savior? You threaten me with a fire that burns for a season and after a little while is quenched, which is ironic, isn't it? But you are ignorant of the fire of everlasting punishment that is prepared for the wicked. I bless you, Father, for judging me worthy of this hour, so that in the company of the martyrs I may share the cup of Christ. Sort of gives a new ring to what you see there in verse 10, doesn't it? Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. But besides suffering persecution, this church was also enduring extreme poverty. And I say that because of what you see in verse 9. It says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. But the word for poverty there isn't the word penia, which we would normally expect to see that describes a poor person. The word there is ptokein, and I don't know if I pronounced that right. There's a P and a T together, and I don't know what that sound is. If it was Polish, I would say it's a Z sound, but it's not. So tokein, though, is beyond the ordinary word for poverty. It's extreme poverty. This is severe poverty they were engaged in. And we don't really know why they were so poor, but the fact that persecution and poverty are linked so closely in verse 9 kind of gives us a clue that maybe there was an antagonistic environment toward their belief in Jesus, and that had made it difficult to earn a living, and maybe had resulted in all of their possessions being taken away from them. That's a possibility. Some have suggested that they were victims of mob violence. We certainly saw that in Ephesus, didn't we? And so therefore there was some sort of looting that happened, and because they were Christians, they were unprotected by the government authorities, and all of their possessions were taken away from them. There are certainly testimonies to that. In fact, you could look in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 34. It says, For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property. Who joyfully accepts that? Well, Christians do, miraculously. So regardless of how they became extremely poor, they were impoverished in a city known for its wealth, by the way, because, and specifically I think this is true, because of their faith, because of those words being linked so closely together. I know your poverty, but in fact, you're rich. You're rich because of your faith in the wonderful promises of God. This is an echo, actually, of James chapter 2, verse 5. Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? So Jesus is quickly reminding the church in Smyrna of their inheritance in this. Even though they live in poverty, they are rich in hope. That's the parenthetical statement there. Rich in a future kingdom. Not only are they poor, and that's a struggle in and of itself, but it appears that these Smyrnans, if that's how you pronounce that, or how you say that, I'm not sure, were being accosted by hostile Jews as well. And last week when we looked at Ephesus, it was pagans who were hostile to the movement of Christ in their city. Now it's a vitriolic Jewish community that's attacking Christians. Verse 9 describes the relationships like this. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So it's likely that this slander took the form of official indictments to the Roman authorities, because they would tell the Roman authorities that the Christians put another king above Caesar, which was true, and therefore were practicing sedition, which was false. That was slander. This would have been a particularly offensive indictment in a city like Smyrna, which enjoyed such a close relationship with Rome, and whose central cult surrounded the worship of the emperor. So the Jewish community clearly saw the church as a threat. They had to get rid of this threat, and so they sought to paint Christians as rebellious and dangerous so that the Roman government would have to deal with them, and apparently that was a successful endeavor because, as he says in verse 10, you're about to be thrown in jail. Well, the Jews couldn't throw them in jail. Only the Romans could do that. You may remember, if you've studied anything about Paul's life, that the same kind of tactic was tried in Thessalonica with Paul. The Jews stirred up a mob against Paul and said to the authorities, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. See, it's almost exactly what I described to you as probably happening in Smyrna. I don't think Satan has any new tactics. There's nothing new under the sun. He's not a creative fellow. And so that's probably the same sort of half-truths that were being hurled at the church in Smyrna. The result of these charges, as we said, is that some of these Christians are being thrown in jail. And there was a death threat hanging over them. So let me quickly say that we need to understand, though, that these Jews are not Jews in terms of how we think of them. They are Jews in name only. They resemble the Jew, but they are more like what Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 2, verses 28 and 29. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly. And circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. And of course, Paul is following in the tradition of what Jesus says to the Pharisees over and over and over. I don't want you to follow the rote letter of the law. I want your heart to be pursuing me. So these Jews were not following God, not in the least bit. They were following their own laws and their own designs and their own desires. And therefore, Jesus says they are not Jews. They are of the synagogue of Satan. They follow Satan's temptations and lies to destroy the work of God. That's what these Jews are doing. That's what it is to be a synagogue of Satan, to be a follower at all of anything that Satan is involved with. And so they're being used by the devil. They think they're in control, but they aren't. They're being used by the devil to cause suffering to the church. Look at what it says in verse 10. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. And so what Jesus is saying is that your struggles appear to be against flesh and blood, but they aren't. This is what Peter tells us. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood. This is what Paul tells us. Our struggle is against the principalities of the air. Peter tells us that the devil prowls around like a roaring lion looking for somebody to devour. And so the devil is actively persecuting you. Even this synagogue of Satan is being used by the devil, which isn't literally a synagogue of Satan. They're not going to synagogue so they can worship Satan. They're going to synagogue so that they can use the law to persecute. But they're under the influence of the devil nonetheless to do his work and slander Christians and get Roman authorities worked up enough so that they think that Christians are the problem and a real threat to the empire and arrest them. And so Jesus says, as you can see on the screen, don't fear. Don't fear. The devil's testing you. You're going to have even more tribulation. It's about to get worse. It's supernatural in its cause, but it is only temporary.